Welcome to Auchtertool, a small village in Fife with a strong sense of community and a long history. But recently, Auchtertool has found itself at the centre of a controversial proposal, plans for a major data centre development in the surrounding area. The proposal has attracted both support and concern, with questions being raised about the potential impact on the local community, the environment, infrastructure, and the future of the area. In this video, we're going to take a look around Auchtertool. I'm going to include what's being proposed and also about the local Say No campaign, while aiming to give a balanced look at the story and let you make up your own mind. So here you are. Welcome to Auchtertool. So we're going to go for a nice, peaceful walk. Here's just some of the countryside that sits right next to Auchtertool. And now I'm going to head up through the village centre and walk right through from end to end. You'll see along the way a lot of signage, all objecting the data centre. So, what is Cato? Cato is the name given to a proposed large-scale AI-focused data centre near Auchtertool in Fife. The proposal has been submitted by ILI Cato Limited, part of Scottish clean energy developer ILI Group. The application seeks planning permission in principle for a major data centre campus. The proposal includes multiple large data hall buildings, electricity substations, standby and emergency infrastructure, security fencing, gatehouses, access roads, parking, drainage and extensive landscaping. The proposed development has a maximum power capacity of around 600 megawatts and would be developed in phases. The site is approximately 25 hectares of development within a much larger site and is currently largely undeveloped land, including farmland and the remains of Hollyards Castle. Some of the proposed buildings could reach approximately 35 metres in height. To put the scale into context, the proposed electricity capacity would make Cato one of the largest individual data centre developments proposed in Scotland. The developer says the centre would provide computing infrastructure for artificial intelligence, cloud computing and other digital services. The proposal forms part of ILI Group's wider plan for a network of large-scale data centres known as the Stoics. So the next question is, why is Cato being proposed? According to ILI Group, the demand for computing power is growing rapidly because of artificial intelligence, cloud computing and other digital services. The company says Scotland is particularly attractive for this type of infrastructure because of its renewable electricity generation, existing electricity infrastructure, fibre connectivity and relatively cool climate. ILI says the cooler Scottish climate can allow data centres to make greater use of free cooling, potentially reducing the amount of energy required for cooling compared with warmer locations. The company also says the Auchtertool site has a strong electricity grid connection and is already identified for employment-related development within the local planning framework. ILI describes Cato as a green data centre and says its intention is to use renewable electricity. The developer also presents the project as part of a wider transition towards low-carbon digital infrastructure and argues that Scotland has an opportunity to become an important location for AI and a data centre investment. So here is the economic benefits claimed by the developer. ILI Group says the Cato project represents an investment of approximately $5 billion. Economic modelling carried out by Bigger Economics for the project estimates that the construction phase could generate around $708 million in gross value added across Scotland, including approximately $105 million in Fife. The same analysis estimates around 9,660 job years could be supported across Scotland during construction, including approximately 1,450 job years in Fife. Once operational, ILI says the wider economic impact could support around 540 jobs across Scotland and generate more than 30 million in annual gross value added locally. The developer also says the project could create opportunities for local suppliers, apprenticeships, skills development and training. ILI has also announced a proposed $500,000 fund intended to support retraining apprenticeships for people affected by the closure of the ExxonMobil ethylene plant at Mossmorton. These figures are projections rather than the guaranteed outcome. The final number of jobs and the wider economic benefit would depend on how the project is ultimately developed, who operates it, and how much of the proposed campus is built. So here are the arguments in favour. Supporters of the proposal, including the developer, point to several potential benefits. First, the project could bring billions of pounds of private investment into Scotland. Second, it could create employment during construction and provide skilled technology-related jobs once operational. Third, supporters argue that data centres are becoming an important part of modern infrastructure because of artificial intelligence, cloud computing, healthcare, scientific research, and many everyday digital services require large amounts of computing capacity. Fourth, the developer argues that Scotland's large renewable electricity resource gives the country an opportunity to attract data centre investment while using lower carbon electricity. Fifth, the project could create opportunities for local companies through construction contracts, maintenance services and supply chains. Sixth, ILI says the project could provide training, apprenticeships and retraining opportunities. Finally, supporters argue that developing digital infrastructure in Scotland could help the country compete internationally in artificial intelligence and other technology industries rather than allowing this investment to take place elsewhere. The Scottish Government broadly supports the development of sustainable data centre infrastructure as part of Scotland's wider artificial intelligence strategy, while also recognising the environmental and infrastructure challenges that come with it. So what exactly is the Scottish Government's position? The Scottish Government's current artificial intelligence strategy for 2026 to 2031 identifies data centres as an important part of Scotland's future digital infrastructure. The Government says Scotland has significant renewable electricity resources and sees an opportunity to attract investment in sustainable data centres. However, the same strategy acknowledges that artificial intelligence is energy intensive and that increased demand for electricity, water and infrastructure creates challenges. The Government's strategy says future data centres should focus on renewable energy, water resilient design, energy efficiency and the reuse of excess heat. It also says that data centre development should deliver tangible benefits to local communities. The Scottish Government plans to publish guidance on what factors should be considered when describing a data centre as green. It is also exploring the possibility of green AI ready zones in appropriate locations, subject to local authority decisions and planning considerations. Therefore, the Scottish Government's position is broadly supportive of sustainable data centre investment, but also recognises that individual developments must still be assessed through the planning and environmental system. So, why are some local people saying no? People campaigning against Cato say their opposition is not necessarily opposition to technology or artificial intelligence itself. Their concern is primarily about the scale and location of the proposed development. The proposed campus would sit immediately beside a relatively small rural community. Residents have argued that buildings reaching around 35 metres high could substantially change the appearance and character of the surrounding landscape. There are also concerns about the amount of electricity required, the potential use of water, noise from the cooling and other equipment, traffic during construction, air emissions from emergency generators, drainage and the wider environmental impact. Campaigners are also concerned about the loss or disturbance of historic and archaeological remains associated with Holyard Castle. The Auchtertool area already contains significant energy infrastructure, including wind turbines, battery storage, electricity infrastructure and the nearby Mossmorton industrial complex. Residents argue that the combined effect of several large developments should be considered rather than looking at Cato in isolation. Some residents also question whether the economic benefits will be large enough to justify the scale of the development and argue that highly automated data centres can create relatively few permanent jobs compared with their enormous physical and energy requirements. The local campaign is therefore focused on the principle that a development of this scale should not proceed without a full understanding of its long-term effects on the community, landscape, environment and infrastructure. How much electricity could Cato use? The proposed Cato development has a maximum power capacity of approximately 600 megawatts. The planning material indicates that the development could ultimately use around 4,000 gigawatt hours of electricity per year, although it would be built in phases and the initial energy would be considerably lower. 4,000 gigawatt hours is equivalent to 4 terawatt hours. For comparison, Scotland generated around 51.8 terawatt hours of electricity in 2024. That means that if a project eventually reached the stated 4 terawatt hour annual consumption, its electricity use would be equivalent to around 7.7% of all electricity generated in Scotland in 2024. This does not mean that Cato would literally take electricity away from Scottish households. Electricity generation and consumption are more complicated than that, and the project is intended to be connected to the electricity grid. However, the scale of the proposed electricity demand is one of the main reasons why campaigners and policy groups are questioning how many large data centres Scotland can accommodate while maintaining sufficient grid capacity for homes, businesses and other industries. The developer argues that electricity would be supplied through renewable sources and that Scotland's renewable generation makes the country particularly suitable for this type of development. What about water? Water is another issue being discussed. Data centres require cooling systems to remove heat produced by computer equipment. The Cato proposal includes cooling infrastructure, but the precise final design would depend on the detailed development. The developer's published information indicates that the projected annual water requirement would be the equivalent to approximately the amount of water used by 239 average homes. ILI has stated that the proposed development would use separate water infrastructure from the system serving Auchtertool village, and Scottish Water has indicated that sufficient capacity exists to support the project. However, local campaigners have questioned the long-term implications of water demand and drainage and argue that these issues require careful assessment before construction begins. The key point is that the project would use water, but the available evidence does not support claims that Cato would use the same amount of water as thousands or millions of homes. The actual impact would depend on the final cooling system, operating conditions and detailed design. The scale and visual impact. One of the most obvious concerns is the physical size of the proposal. The development would introduce large industrial-style data hall buildings into an area currently categorised by open countryside. Some buildings could reach approximately 35 metres in height. Residents have described the proposed development as being capable of dominating the surrounding landscape and potentially appearing larger than the village itself. The developer's design team has taken a different approach, arguing that the buildings can be carefully designed and landscaped to respond to the surrounding environment. The proposal includes woodland planting, wetland areas, hedgerows, wildflower meadows, landscape bunds and other landscaping intended to produce visual effects. However, landscaping cannot completely remove the physical presence of buildings of this scale. The planning process will therefore have to consider whether the proposed design, landscaping and mitigation are sufficient to make the development acceptable in its particular location. Hollyard Castle. The proposed development site contains the remains of Hollyard's Castle, a historic site associated with the Auchtertool area. Campaigners are concerned that parts of the proposed development could result in the loss or disturbance of historic remains. The planning documents identify heritage and archaeological considerations as part of the development. A request has been made to Historic Environment Scotland for Hollyard's Castle to be assessed for possible designation. The heritage question is therefore not simply about whether the site looks attractive. It concerns whether historic remains should be preserved in their current location, or whether archaeological recording and other mitigation would be an acceptable alternative. This is ultimately a matter for the relevant planning and heritage authorities to consider. What about flooding and drainage? Flood risk and surface water management are important parts of the planning assessment for Cato. The site contains areas associated with the watercourses and drainage, including the Drinocky Burn. The development would create a large amount of new built and hard surfaced area, meaning surface water would need to be carefully managed. The applicant has submitted drainage and flood risk assessments proposing measures such as sustainable drainage systems, ponds and other infrastructure. Campaigners have nevertheless raised concerns about flood risk and argue that developing on or around areas affected by flood risk requires particularly careful consideration. This is an issue that must be assessed through the planning process rather than decided simply by either supporters or opponents of the project. Noise and air quality though. A large data centre operates continuously and requires cooling equipment, electrical infrastructure and backup systems. Local residents are therefore concerned about the potential for continuous background noise, particularly at night. There are also concerns about emergency and standby generators. The precise number and specification of the some equipment would depend on the final design, meaning the full operational impact cannot be known at the planning, permission and principal stage. The developer would be required to meet the relevant environmental and planning regulations, and technical assessments will be considered by the appropriate authorities. The issue for opponents is whether those controls will be sufficient to protect the residents living close to the site. The issue for the developer is whether modern equipment, design, acoustic controls and appropriate operating conditions can allow the facility to operate without unacceptable impacts. The green argument. How green is Cato? The term green data centre is central to the debate. ILI describes Cato as a green data centre and says it intends to use renewable electricity for highly efficient technology. The developer also points to Scotland's renewable energy resources and the possibility of using cleaner electricity to power the facility. However, opponents argue that using renewable electricity does not automatically make a development environmentally neutral. They point to the land required, the construction materials, the physical scale of the buildings, electricity demand, cooling requirements, backup generation, water use, traffic and impacts on wildlife and landscape. The Scottish Government itself recognises the challenge in the AI strategy. Its strategy identifies increased energy use, water consumption and pressure on renewable capacity as environmental risks associated with AI infrastructure. The government says these risks should be addressed through renewable power, computing, water resilient design, energy efficiency, heat reuse and environmental planning. Therefore, whether Cato should ultimately be considered green is not simply a question of whether its electricity comes from renewable resources. It also depends on how efficiently it operates, how its water and energy systems are designed, what happens with waste heat, how backup power is provided, and how effectively environmental impacts are mitigated. Where does the project stand now? As of August 2026, the Cato data centre has not been approved for construction. ILI Cato Limited submitted planning permission for principal application 26/01243/PPP to Fife Council. Planning permission in principle is not the same as permission to immediately construct the finished data centre. It establishes whether the principle of the proposed development can be accepted, with further details and conditions dealt with through the planning process. The application has generated significant local opposition, including the Say No to Cato campaign and objections from residents and environmental organisations. There has also been a significant environmental impact question. The Scottish Government's Planning and Environmental Appeals Division is currently considering the related environmental impact assessment matter for the Cato proposal. The Scottish Government case record identifies the site as land north of Camilla Road at Gleniston, Auchtertool, and identifies Fife Council's application 26/01243/PPP. The case was received by the Scottish Government's Planning and Environmental Appeals Division on the 15th of June 2026 and is currently allocated to a planner within Planning and Architecture. This does not mean the Scottish Government has approved the data centre. It means that the environment impact issue is currently being considered as part of the planning progress. The final decision on the planning application has not yet been made. Therefore, at this point, Cato remains a proposal and the debate is still ongoing. What role does the Scottish Government have? Fife Council remains the planning authority dealing with the Cato planning application. The involvement of the Scottish Government's Planning and Environmental Appeals Division relates to the environmental impact assessment process. This should not be confused with the Scottish Government simply deciding whether it likes or dislikes the data centre. Planning decisions involve consideration of national planning policy, local planning policy, environmental effects, infrastructure, landscape, heritage, transport, community impacts, and other material considerations. The Scottish Government has its own national policies that influence the planning process, including National Planning Framework 4. At the same time, Fife Council must consider the proposal against the relevant local development plan and other planning policies. The Scottish Government's wider AI policy is supportive of sustainable digital infrastructure, but that does not automatically mean that every individual data centre proposal must be approved. Each proposal still has to go through the planning process. The Cato debate and the strongest unbiased summary. At the heart of the debate is a simple question. Does the potential economic and technological benefit of a 600 megawatt data centre justify building something of this scale beside a small rural community? Supporters say Cato could bring around $5 billion of investment, create jobs, support Scotland's growing technology sector and make use of the country's renewable electricity resources. Opponents say the scale is excessive for the location and have raised concerns about landscape, heritage, energy, demand, water, noise, biodiversity, flood risk, infrastructure, and the relatively small number of permanent on-site jobs. Neither side can yet exactly say what the final outcome will be. The project has not been approved. The planning process is ongoing. The Scottish Government supports the development of sustainable digital infrastructure in principle, while also acknowledging that energy, water and environmental impacts need to be carefully managed. The ultimate decision will therefore depend on the planning evidence, consultation responses environmental considerations, national and local planning policy, and the assessment of the relevant authorities. For viewers, the important thing is to distinguish between what is being proposed, what the developer says could happen, what campaigners fear could happen, and what has actually been established through the planning process. You'll just see how quiet and peaceful this place actually is at the moment. So I'm going to continue on this way. From what I can see is it's advertised as it would be the land north of Camilla Road that they're planning on building this site. So I'm going to head up towards that way, as the site is not going to be in the middle of the village. It's going to be just north, out in the fields, the countryside. So here is Camilla Road. So they're saying it's the land north of here. So I've not got much charge left in my drone, but I'm going to pop it up just directly above and show what the village is like and the nature surrounding it. And just as a little extra, I've came up to see the Auchtertool Kirk, which is just slightly west of the town. So look how peaceful this landscape actually is.